but I was thinking about French poetry, which is in a play of Racine, in fact. It's a beautiful sentence. In French, c'était pendant l'horreur d'une profonde nuit. In English, it was during the horror of a profound night. Maybe Racine was thinking to the election of Trump. It was during the horror of a profound night. And so it was like an obligation for me to speak, to discuss of that sort of event in a negative sense. Because it's impossible for me to be here in front of you and to speak of something very interesting in academic terms. I think it's a necessity to think, to discuss what happens during the horror of the profound night just yesterday. You know, for me, but I think for many people, it has been, in some sense, a sort of surprise. And we are very often in that sort of surprise under the law of affects, fear, depression, anger, panic, and so on. But we know that philosophically all these affects are not really a good reaction, because in some sense it's too much affect in front of the enemy. And so I think it's a necessity to think really beyond the affect, beyond fear, depression, and so on, to think the situation of today, the situation of the world today, where something like that is possible. That somebody like Trump becomes the president of the United States. And so my goal this evening is to present not exactly an explanation, but something like a clarification of the possibility of something like that, and also some indications submitted to discussion concerning what we must do for that. What we must do, which is not precisely to be in the law, under the law of affect, of negative affect, but at the level of thinking, action, political determination, and so on. So I begin by a very general vision, not of the situation of the United States today, but the situation of the world today. What is the world of today, where that sort of fact is possible? And I think that the most important point to begin is the historical victory of globalized capitalism. Historical victory of globalized capitalism. We must be in front of that fact. in some sense, from the 80s of the last century to today, that is during near 40 years, so something like the middle of the century, we have the historical victory of globalized capitalism for many reasons and many historical facts. First, naturally, the complete failure of socialist states, Russia, China, and more generally, the failure of a collectivist vision of economy and social laws of countries. And this point is not a small point. You know, this point is really a change, not only the objective situation of the world today, but maybe at the level of subjectivity too. During more than 2 centuries, there have existed in public opinion always two ways concerning the destiny of human beings. We can say that before approximately the 80s of the last century, we have always, at a very general level, a subjective general level, 2 possibilities concerning the historical destiny of human beings. First, the way of liberalism in its classical sense. Here, liberal has many significations. But I take liberal in its primitive sense, that is, fundamentally, that the private property is the key of social organization, at the price of enormous inequalities. But the price is the price. At the end, for the liberalism, the private property must be the key of social organization. And on the other side, we have the socialist way, the communist way. There is different words. In their abstract sense, that is, the end of inequalities must be the most fundamental goal of human political activity. The end of inequalities, even at the price of violent revolution. So, on one side, a peaceful vision of history as a continuation of something which is very old. That is, private property as the key of social organization, and on the other side, something new, something which probably begins with the French Revolution, which is the proposition that there is another way, that in some sense the continuity of the historical existence of human beings must accept a rupture between a very long sequence where inequalities, private property, and so on are the law of collective existence, and another fashion, another vision of what is that sort of destiny, and the most important point being, in fact, the question of equality and inequality. And this conflict between liberalism in its classical sense and the new idea under many different names, anarchy, communism, socialism, and so on, is probably the great signification of the 19th century and of a big part of the next century too. So, during approximately near 2 centuries, we have something like a strategic choice. A strategic choice concerning not only the local events of politics, the national obligations, the wars, and so on, but concerning what is really the historical destiny of human beings as such, the historical destiny of the construction of humanity as such. In some sense, our time, from the 80s to today, is the time of the apparent end of this choice. The disparition, the progressive disparition of that sort of choice. We have today, in fact, the dominant idea that there exists no global choice, that there is no other solution. It was the word of Thatcher, with no other solution. No other solution. No other solution except, naturally, the liberalism, or today, generally, we speak of neoliberalism. No other solution. And this point is very important because Thatcher herself is not saying that this solution, the liberalism, is a very good one. It's not the problem for her. The problem is that it's the only solution. And so, in the contemporary propaganda, the point is not to say that globalized capitalism is excellent, because it's clear that it's not. It is not. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that monstrous inequalities cannot be a solution for the historical destiny of human beings. Everybody knows that. But the argument is, okay, it's not so good, but it's the only real possibility. And so our time, in my opinion, is a definition of our time is the attempt to impose to humanity at the scale of the world itself the conviction that there is only one way for the history of a human being. And without saying that this way is excellent, that this way is a very good one, but by saying that there is no other solution, no other way. So, we can define our moment as the moment of the primitive conviction of liberalism is dominant in the form that private property and free market compose the unique possible destiny of human beings. And so it's also a definition of a human subject. What is, in this vision, a human subject? A human subject is a labor, a consumer, an owner, or nothing at all. That is the strict definition of today of what is a human being. So that is the general vision, the general problem, and the general law of the contemporary world. Now, what are the political effects of all that? At the level of political life, what is the consequences of this dominant vision of a world in which we can find only one way? all governments must accept that it is the case. In the world today, we cannot be at the direction of a state without acceptation of the vision of the unicity of the way. We have no government on the world which is saying something else. And why? Why finally, if we examine the position of the socialist French government, of the dictator of the Communist Party in China, or the government of United States, or the government of Japan, of India, everybody says the same thing. The globalized capitalism is the unique way for the existence of human beings. I think that all political decision at the level of the state today is in strict dependency of what I name a monster, the globalized capitalism and its inequalities. In some sense, it is not true that a government today is something free. It's not free at all. It is inside the global determination, and it must affirm that what it is doing is in dependency of this interiority of the global determination. And the monster is more and more a monster. We must know the real situation concerning inequalities. We have the fundamental phenomena of concentration of capital. The concentration of capital is something extraordinary today. We must know that today 264 persons have as their property the equivalent of 3 billions of other people. It's much more than is the primitive existence of monarchy and so on. Inequality today is much more important than in every other situation in the history of human beings. And so that sort of historical monster, which is also the unique way for the existence of humanity, is really in the dynamic of more and more inequalities and not at all of more and more freedom. And the position of the state today is the same everywhere. It's accepted law by the French government, by the Chinese Communist Party, by the power of Putin in Russia, by the Islamic State in Syria, and naturally it's also a law for the President of the United States. So, progressively, and that is the most important consequence concerning, in fact, the election of Trump, progressively, all the political oligarchy, all the political class becomes the same group at the scale of the world itself. A group of people which is only abstractly divided. Republican and Democrats, socialists and liberals, left and right, and so on. All that sort of division today are purely abstract and not real. because all that lies in the same economical and political background. This political oligarchy today in the Western world is progressively losing the control of the capitalist machinery. That is the reality. Across crises, false solutions, all classical political governments create at a big scale in their people, frustration, misunderstanding, anger, and obscure revolt. All that against what is the unique way proposed by all members of the political class today, with some differences, but some small differences. The exercise of politics today is the exercise of very small differences inside the same global way. But all that has many effects on people in general. Effects of disorientation, total absence of orientation or direction of the life, no strategic vision of the future of humanity. And in that sort of situation, a big part of the people search in obscurity on the side of false novelties, irrational visions, and return to dead traditions, and so on. So, in front of political oligarchy, we have the apparition of a new sort of activists, new supports of violent and vulgar demagogy, and these guys are much more on the side of gangsters and mafia than on the side of educated politicians. And so the choice here has been the choice between that sort of guy and the rest of educated politician. And the result has been the legal choice of the new form of political vulgarity and something subjectively violent in the political proposition. In some sense, this new political figure, Trump, but many others today, are near the fascists of the 30s. There is something similar. But first, without, alas, their strong enemies of the 30s, which was the Communist Party. It's a sort of democratic fascism. It's a paradoxical designation, but sort of democratic fascism. That is, they are inside the democratic play, inside the democratic apparatus, but they play something different, another music in that sort of context. And I think it's not only the case here with Donald Trump, racist, machist, violent, and also, which is a fascist characteristic, without any consideration for logic and rationality. Because the discourse, the speaking, the mode of speaking of that sort of democratic fascism is precisely a sort of dislocation of language, a sort of possibility to say anything and the contrary of anything. There is no problem. The language is not a language of explanation, but a language to create some affects. It's an affective language which creates a false unity, but a practical unity. And so we have started with Donald Trump, but it has been the case before in Italy with Berlusconi. Berlusconi maybe has been the first figure of that sort of new democratic fascism, with exactly the same characteristic: vulgarity, a sort of pathological relationship to women. Really pathological, not only all the relationship, but really a provocative relationship to women, and possibility to say and to do publicly some things inacceptable for a big part of human beings of today. But it was the case also with Orban in Hungary today. And in my sense, in France, it has been the case with Sarkozy. And it's also the case progressively in India or in the Philippines, and even in Poland or in Turkey. So it's really, at the scale of the world, the apparition of a new figure of political determination, which is a figure which is very often inside the democratic constitution, but which is, in some sense, also outside. And I think that we can name fascists, because it was the case in the 30s. After all, Hitler also has been a victory in elections. So I name fascists that sort of guy which are inside the democratic play, but in some sense also outside. Inside and outside. And inside to finally be outside. So it's really a novelty, but a novelty which is inscribed inside the general figure of the world today, because it's also something for many people, not of a solution, but a new manner to be in the democratic play, where, on the side of classical oligarchy, there is no difference at all. In some sense, the principal effect of Trump is an effect of something new. In fact, in the details, there is nothing new. Because considering it's impossible to think that it's new to be racist, machist, and so on. It's very old things. It's very old things. But in the context of the classical oligarchy today, this very old thing seems to be something new. And so Trump is in the position to say that the novelty is Trump. In the moment where he is saying some things absolutely primitive and absolutely old-fashioned. And so we are also in the time where something like a return to the old fashion, the old existence of something, can appear as something new. And this conversion of the new in the old is also a characteristic of that sort of new fascism. All that describe, I think, our present solution at the level of politics. I think we must consider that we are in a fatal dialectics of four terms. First, the complete brutality and blind violence of the capitalism of today. Okay, in the Western world, we are not facing completely this brutality or this violence. But if you are in Africa, we see that, really. And if you are in the Middle East, too. And finally, if you are in Asia, too. And so it's a fundamental term of our world today, that is the return of capitalism to what is in fact its very essence. That is savage concurrence, savage fight of everybody against everybody for domination. So complete brutality and blood violence of the savage capitalism of today. The first term. Second term, the decomposition of the classical political oligarchy. The classical parties, Democrat, Republican, Socialist, etc. Decomposition in the direction, finally, of the apparition of a sort of new fascism. New fascism, we don't know the future of that sort of apparition. What is the future of Trump? In some sense, we don't know, really. And maybe Trump don't know its proper destiny. It was visible in the night. You have the Trump before the power, and subitly you have the Trump in the power, which is in some sense afraid, not completely satisfied, because he knows that he cannot say, he cannot speak as freely than before. And so, and to speak freely was exactly the potency of Trump. But now, with the government, the administration, the army, economists, bankers, and so on, it's another story. And so we have seen in the night Trump passing from one play to another play, of one theater to another theater. And in the second theater, it was not so good. Not so good than before. You cannot say, women. It was difficult. President of the United States. But we don't know, really. We don't know what is the real possibility of that sort of guy when he becomes the President of the United States. In any case, we have really a symbol of the decomposition of the classical political oligarchy and the birth of a sort of the new figure of a new fascism with a future that we don't know, but I think is certainly not a very interesting future for people in general. Third, we have the popular frustration, the feeling of an obscure disorder in the public opinion of many people, and principally the poor people, the people of provincial status, the peasants of many countries, and also the workers without a job, and so on. All that population, which progressively is reduced by the brutality of contemporary capitalism to nothing at all, which are no possible existence, and which stay in some places without job, without money, and without orientation, without existential orientation. And this point is the third very important term of the planetary situation today. The lack of orientation, of stability, the feeling of the destruction of their world without the construction of another world. So a sort of void destruction. And the last term, fourth term, is the complete lack of an other strategic way. the absence today of another strategic way. There exist many political experiences. I don't say that there is nothing at all on this side. We know that new riots, new occupation of places, new mobilization, new ecological determination, and so on. So it's not the absence of all forms of resistance, protestation. No, I don't say that. But the lack of another strategic way. That is something which is at the same level that the contemporary conviction that the capitalism is the only way possible. The lack of the strength of the affirmation of another way. It's the lack of what I name an idea, a great idea. Great idea which is the possibility of unification, global unification, strategic unification of all forms of resistance and for invention. An idea is a sort of mediation between the individual subject and the collective historical and political task. And it's the possibility of action across and with very different subjectivities, but under the same idea in some sense. These 4 points, so the general and strategic domination of globalized capitalism, the decomposition of classical political oligarchy, the popular disorientation and frustration, and the lack of another strategic way, composes, in my opinion, the crisis of today. We can define the contemporary world in the term of a global crisis, which is not reducible to the economic crisis of the last years, which is much more, I think, a subjective crisis, because the destiny of human beings is more and more unclear for themselves. After that, what does be done? What does be done? The question of Lenin. I think concerning the presidential election year, the election of Trump, I think what we must affirm that one reason of the success of Trump is that the true contradiction today, the real contradiction today, the most important contradiction cannot be between two forms of the same world. The world of globalized capitalism, of imperialist wars, and of lack of any idea concerning the destiny of human beings. I know that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are very different. I am not saying, I don't identify Trump and Hillary Clinton. But this difference, which is important, is there exists a level where this difference, that is the difference between new fascism and old political oligarchy, that is the difference. And old political oligarchy is less horrible than new fascism. So I understand perfectly that at the end we prefer Hillary Clinton. But we cannot forget that in some sense this difference is inside the same world. It's done the expression of two different strategic visions of the world. And I think the success of Trump is possible only because the true contradiction of the world cannot be expressed, cannot be symbolized by the opposition between Hillary Clinton and Trump. Because Hillary Clinton and Trump are in the same world, very different, but very different in the same world. And so, in fact, during all the preparation of the election, during the primaries, the true contradiction, in my opinion, has been between Trump and Bernie Sanders. It was a true contradiction. We can think what we want concerning the two terms of this contradiction. We can say that Trump is maybe something excessive, on the side of a new fascism and so on, and we can see that Bernie Sanders is something which is, in some sense, of socialist nature, but finally, Bernie Sanders is in the necessity to go on the side of Clinton and so on and so on. But I think at the level of symbolization, which is so important, the true contradiction of our world were symbolized by the opposition of Trump and Bernie Sanders and not by the opposition of Trump and Hillary Clinton. Because we have in Bernie Sanders, in the proposition of Bernie Sanders, some points which are beyond the world as it is. And we have not something like that in the proposition of Hillary Clinton. And so we have a lesson of dialectics, that is the theory of contradictions. In some sense, the true contradictions between Hillary Clinton and Trump was a relative contradiction and not an absolute one. That is a contradiction in the same parameters, in the same construction of the world. But the contradiction between Bernie Sanders and Trump was in fact the beginning of the possibility of a true contradiction. That is a contradiction with the world and something which is beyond the world. In some sense, Trump was really on the side of reactive and obscure popular subjectivity inside the world as it is. But Bernie Sanders was on the side of rational, active and clear popular subjectivity, oriented beyond the world as it is, even and something which was unclear but beyond the world as it is. So the result of the election is of conservative nature. It's purely conservative, because it's the result of a false contradiction, in some sense. A contradiction which is not the true contradiction. And which is also, across this election, the continuation of the crisis of today. The crisis of the 4 terms I speak before. Today, against Trump, we cannot desire Clinton or somebody of the same figure. We must create a return, if it is possible, to the true contradiction. It's the lesson of that sort of terrible event. That is, we must propose a political orientation which goes beyond the world as it is, even if it is, at the beginning, in not completely clear manner. When we begin something, we have not the complete development of that sort of thing. But we must begin. We must begin. That is the point. After Trump, we must begin. It's not only to resist, to negate, and so on. We must begin something, really. And this question of the beginning is the beginning of the return to the true contradiction, to a real choice, to a real strategic choice concerning the orientation of human beings. We must reconstruct the idea that against the monstrous inequalities of the present capitalism, against also the new gangsters of classical politics, like Trump, it's possible to create once more a political field with two strategic orientations, and not only one. To return of something which has been the occasion of the great political movement of the 19th century and of the beginning of the last century. We must, if I can say something in a philosophical manner, we must go beyond the one in the direction of the two. Not one orientation, but two orientations. The creation of a return to a new, a fundamental choice as the very essence of politics. In fact, if there is only one strategic way, politics progressively disappears. And in some sense, Trump is a symbol of that sort of disparition. Because what is the politics of Trump? Nobody knows. It's something like a figure and not as a politics. And so we can return to politics is by necessity the returns of the existence of a real choice. So finally, at the level of philosophical generality, it's the dialectical return to the real two beyond the one. And we can propose some names for that sort of return. As you know, my vision is to propose the corrupted world of communism. Corrupted by Blue Day experiences and so on. The name is only a name, so we are free to propose other names, not a problem. But we have something which is interesting, is the primitive meaning of this old and corrupted world. And this meaning is in fact composed of 4 points, 4 principles. And that sort of principles can be a support for the creation of a new political field with 2 strategic orientations. The first point is that it's not a necessity that the key of social organization lies in private property and monstrous inequalities. It's not a necessity. We must affirm that it's not a necessity. And we can organize limited experiences which demonstrate that it's not a necessity. That it's not true that forever private property and monstrous inequalities must be the law of the becoming of humanity. It's the first point. The second point is that it's not a necessity that workers will be separated between noble work, like intellectual creation or direction or government, and on the other side, scorners labor, like manual work and common and material existence. So the specialization of the labor is not an eternal law. And especially the opposition between intellectual work and manual work must be suppressed at long term. It's the second principle. The third is that it's not a necessity for human beings to be separated by national, racial, religious or sexual boundaries. The equality must exist across differences. And so difference is an obstacle to equality. Equality must be a dialectics of difference itself. And this, we must refuse that in the name of differences, equality is impossible. So boundaries, refuse of the other in any forms, all that must disappear. It's not a natural law. And the last principle is that it's not a necessity that exists a state in the form of a separated and armed power. So these 4 points can be resumed. Collectivism against private property, polymorphous worker against specialization, concrete universalism against close identities, and free association against the state. It's only principle, it's not a program. But it's principle, with this principle, we can judge all political programs, decisions, parties, ideas, from the point of view of these 4 principles. Take a decision, okay, is this decision in the direction of the 4 principles or not? You know, the principles are the protocol of judgment concerning all decision, ideas, proposition. If a decision, a proposition is in the direction of the 4 principles, we can say it's a good one. We can examine if it is possible and so on. It's a good one. If clearly it's against the principles, it's a bad decision, bad idea, bad program. So we have a principle of judgment in the political field and to the construction of the new strategical project. That is, in some sense, the possibility to have a true vision of what is really in the new direction, the new strategical direction of humanity as such. Bernie Sanders proposes to construct a new political group under the title Our Revolution. Our Revolution. The success of Trump must open a new chance for that sort of idea. We can trust him for the moment. We can judge if it's really a proposition which goes beyond the present world. We can judge if something is proposed which is in conformity with the 4 principles. So we can do something. We can do something, and we must do. Because if we do nothing at all, we are only in the fascination, the cupidity of fascination by the depressive success of Trump. our revolution, why not? Why not? Against their reaction, our revolution, it's a good idea. In any case, I am on this side. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Raise your hand and Robert will bring the microphone around to you.
How you doing? I wasn't here for the beginning, but I'm with the Revolution Club. We're revolutionary communists. We're organizing now to overthrow this system. But as far as what is to be done, that's what we see needs to be done. But I don't see Bernie Sanders as an alternative. He's more of the same shit. Like he'll appeal to people on their American chauvinism, America first. I mean, that's Trump's what got Trump to power. As long as you have this system, that soil is still there for a fascist movement to grow, right? And there's a need to overthrow it. Right? There's a need to get real about it, not just philosophize about it, but actually have a real material force that could go up against their repressive forces, their military, right? And actually overthrow it, defeat and dismantle. That's what we're aiming to do. Right? And we're calling on people to get with the Revolution Club, right? To get with the Revolution Club and organize for an actual revolution.
Il dit qu'il est avec un groupe qui s'appelle le Club Révolution et ils sont contre Bernie Sanders.
Oh oui.
Parce qu'il ne fait pas vraiment la révolution. Il demande aux gens de prendre son côté et de vraiment choisir une révolution concrète.
Yeah, you know, my reference to Bernie Sanders was not a principle of adhesion. It was only an example of what I name the true contradiction. The true contradiction at the level of elections, not at the level of revolutionary action, of activism. But at the level of election, I was saying that true contradiction was much more between Bernie Sanders and Trump than between Hillary Clinton and Trump. After that, if you think that Bernie Sanders is in the light of revolutionary principle, something which must be abandoned, etc. It's a history of political determination in United States, and it's not my my obligation. It's not my function. So it's an other discussion. It's an other discussion, which is what is the concrete determination in that sort of country, which really opens the strategic way, the new strategic way, inside the domination of the globalized capitalism. And naturally, we must have on this point many discussions, experiences, attempts, and so on. And so, if somebody speaks of our revolution, I say, okay. But naturally, I must see what happens, what is said, what sort of program is constructed, and so on. But I agree with you on a fundamental point. We must do something. Certainly. We must act.
Thank you very much. I had an opportunity this summer when I was in Chile to attend a lecture by Angela Davis, the first time, even though she's from here, the first time she had come to Chile in over 40 years since she was aligned with the Allende regime. And she was speaking about why the term all lives matter, in that response to Black Lives Matter, she described that as the tyranny of singularity, in the sense that the affirmation of the one, as you put it, rather than the absence of the dialectical opposition, actually affirms the ontological system of power that produces the term all lives matter. So my question is, obviously Trump's election is incredibly dangerous and threatening for powerful social movements like Black Lives Matter, like the Dakota Pipeline right now, and there's so many others. What of those movements now? Because they are very specific, and they need to be specific, because they're about territory, and they're about culture, and they're about history. What of those movements, and how do they challenge that one?
Il a dit d'abord qu'il a vu Angela Davis en Chili, c'était la première fois qu'elle était là, et elle était d'accord avec toi sur l'Inde, etc. Alors maintenant, il demande qu'est-ce qu'on fait de ces mouvements comme Black Lives Matter, Dakota Pipeline, tu connais ce que c'est?
Oui.
En face de Trump. Pour les mouvements spécifiques comme ça, ils sont en danger.
Yes, I think that in the context of the election of Trump, naturally we must also continue and protect all forms of movement, organization, with figure of resistance which exist. It's even a strong necessity. We don't know exactly what Trump signified, in fact. It's not evident, because a characteristic of Trump was to say everything. and so, because it was, and I think on the point that it was its conception to propose himself as saying everything. But we don't know exactly the level in which Trump is really dangerous. Really, it's obscure, this point. But we know that in some days or some months. In any case, we must protect what exists. What exists precisely, in some part, as an attempt to go beyond the world as it is. All the question of ecological fights, fights concerning minorities, in Europe the question of refugees, and so on and so on. There is vivid political activities, vivid militant activities. But I think that maybe we can have something more concerning after the election of Trump, which is to go beyond the separation of that sort of experiences with discussion, collectivization of experience, and so on, to search something like a global new idea. It's very important today. I am sure. We cannot only oppose this to the globalized capitalism, some very important but localized experiences. We must have localized experiences, but as much as possible inside a strategic vision which clearly for everybody is outside the world as it is in some sense, inside but outside too. And it is why it's the meditation concerning Trump is also a strategic one. It's a strategic one because Trump is also a fact on the side of the enemy. You know, it's a surprise for enemies, Trump too. Yeah. It's a surprise for enemies. And so it's a surprise for enemies, so it's a symptom. To take medical, Trump is a symptom. It's a symptom of the decomposition of the political world of enemies. And we must observe what is exactly that sort of decomposition today, and maybe this decomposition propose also some new possibilities for us. Because this decomposition is, in some sense, something dangerous, something like a new fascism and so on, but it's also a division and a symptom of weakness of the political organization of the enemy. And so we can explain inside our militant experiences all that, of discussion concerning the global situation, and to observe not only the dangerous signification of Trump, but also Trump as a symptom of something as a new weakness in the global systematic functionment of political orientation today.
As far as I'm concerned, there's only one stage. There's only one stage in the history of humanity that the individual destiny of human beings are dominated by such global determination, and that is at the very primitive stage of civilization, where individual behaviors, they're determined by biological constructs, and such behavior is animalistic. And now in this new age for global capitalistic determination, the behavior of individual is becoming more civilized, but the collective behavior of groups, they're becoming more animalistic. So my question is that to what extent should we value this type of recurrence, and or to consider to what extent this recurrence is necessary for the development of human society?
What's the recurrence?
Of the animal, the sort of pre-capitalistic, purely animal.
Avant, listen to me.
Question of language. It's a universality across differences.
Il disait qu'avant, l'homme était sous la détermination de l'animal.
Oui,
Enfin, et maintenant, c'est l'individu, le collectif qui devient animaliste.
Maintenant, il y a un retour à l'animal.
Oui,
je pense.
oui.
Et c'est une bonne chose ou non?
Ah oui.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think that it's the whole question of what sort of novelty, what sort of new creation lies in capitalism itself. It's clear that the domination of capitalism modifies the idea of humanity, certainly. And it's true in a materialist direction. That is, in the acceptation that at the end, the most important determination of collectivity is of economic nature. But what sort of economic nature in the capitalism? Is a vision of the individuality, which is a vision that individuality is by necessity something egoist in some sense, something in relation which is proper interest, is the first point. A second point, in some sense, in opposition to others, because competition, because competition is the law of the world. And so if competition is the most important law of collective creation, that is that there is something as a definition of human being, first by its proper interest, and second by competition. And is it an obligation to accept the description of humanity? I think that we can refuse this description. This description is materialist in appearance, but in some sense is normative. It's normative. It is saying that we must be in competition. We must be in regard to our proper interest. So it's not at all a materialist description, because we can also say that we have concrete examples that many people are able to do something very different of all that. To go beyond competition in fraternité and so on, and to go proper interest in direction of collective interest and so on. So I think that we must refuse also that sort of materialism inside a capitalist vision, which reduces, in some sense, not only humanity to animality, but humanity to a vision where proper interest and competition are the fundamental laws of the human existence. But after maybe solidarity, association, and love are also laws, possible laws of the existence of humanity. And when we have two strategical ways concerning the destiny of humanity, it's also at the level of what is the most significant determination of human beings. And I think if you accept to say that fundamental determination of human beings are proper interest and competition, you are in the capitalist subjectivity. And we cannot create something which goes beyond capitalism inside the capitalistic subjectivity. It's impossible. After that, we can say, okay, but maybe it's true that we are poor animals with a proper interest and competition against others. Okay, in this sense, accept capitalism and so on. It's a unique way. So it's a philosophical level. We must affirm that human beings are capable of something different, that strict relationship to their proper interest and to relationship to the others under the law of competition. And we have many examples that it is possible. So it's a choice. It's a choice. You know that competition exists, but why competitions would be the law of the collective existence? Because we know also that we have many examples of something which is not at all reducible to competition. And to collective movement, fraternité, and interest for the other, and so on. All that exists. All that is material too. And so at the end, there is always a choice, which is not only a choice concerning the vision of the world, but also a choice concerning what is your vision of subjectivity, of human subjectivity. And if humanity is able of something which go beyond egoism and competition, we must sustain this possibility and not affirm that, okay, but finally, egoism and competition are the two fundamental determination of human beings. Because capitalism is a pessimistic vision of humanity. It's a very important point. It's not at all an optimistic vision, it's a pessimistic vision. For capitalism, finally, a human being is a cruel beast in competition with others, only relationship to proper interest and so on. The horrible beast. And it is also a good reason to go beyond capitalism, to create a beast of a better beast.
Perhaps we should end on that. Or? Thank you so much.